We should be live now. We will wait a minute or two before we get into the discussion because we want to give people a chance to get here. They don't usually have the link at the start. Some of our sharers, okay, we'll put up the link, and then people will start to arrive.
Sounds good.
So we should be starting to arrive in 2 or 3 minutes from now or so.
Perfect.
We have 2 people here now, in fact. Hi, folks.
Hello, everyone.
Okay, we have Elizabeth and Gopal. Okay, and Dave.
Oh, there's Michelle.
Okay,
hi, honey.
Michelle.
And there's my campaign manager, Brian. Hey, Brian.
Hey, Brian. Nice to see you. Hi, Russell. And Lauren Hart. I noticed Lauren was on there. And Cher Christ. And Jackie Kandorp. Okay, I think we can start now. We have a kind of a minion here, one might say, okay, or more than a minion, so we can start.
All right.
Okay, so this is Joe Firestone for Real Progressives, and this is an odd time for me, but it's Thursday, okay, at 8:30 p.m. And my guest for tonight is Michael Weiss, running in the Democratic primary in the Nevada 3rd District. And he is running in a tight race with, I guess there are 5 other people right now, Michael, correct?
There's 6, actually. 6 have filed with the FEC originally, and we've never seen the 6th one. Generally, when there's been events, it's been at most the 5 of us, but there's one other individual that did file, but I've never seen him. I don't think anybody has.
Okay, so an absentee filer we have. That's an interesting thing. Now, okay, before we get to the issues tonight, which we do want to focus on, we have to do a correction of the record by Michael, and so I'm going to turn things over to him so he is able to do the correction of the record. Okay,
thank you.
I will show his name now and my name also. So I'm sure you can see us both now, everyone.
Yes. Well, Joe, thank you very much for bringing me on here. I did watch the interview that you did with Mr. Schiffman, and during that time, he had insinuated that I was taking money from a PAC, from Wolf PAC, which is a organization that is geared towards getting money out of politics via a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, which I support, but they do not give money to candidates. They have, no association with any political party, and I have never received any money from them whatsoever. Now, I did volunteer for Wolfpack before my campaign began. And where'd you go? Am I too loud?
No, you're fine. That's all right.
You what?
I said, you're fine. It's all right.
Okay. So I had volunteered.
Going.
What?
I said, keep going, please.
Okay. I had volunteered for Wolfpack in 2016, before I had even considered running for office. I was just, helping get the word out and, trying to educate people about, Citizens United and how to stop it and everything. But during that time, I didn't get paid anything. And my involvement with Wolfpack has been substantially reduced, pretty much nothing. I go to the meetings from time to time, but I'm not getting paid now. I wasn't getting paid then from Wolfpack, and they never will pay me because they don't endorse political candidates. And I think one of the things that got confused was Wolfpack's association with Justice Democrats. Both Justice Democrats and Wolfpack were founded by Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks, but the two organizations are not affiliated or associated anymore. So beyond that, and they don't talk to each other. And Justice Democrats does endorse political candidates. And helps them, raise funds from individual donations. But I have not been endorsed by Justice Democrats, nor has any other candidate in CD03 at this point. So what he was insinuating, that I am somehow, being funded by a political organization committee or a political action committee, or that my campaign is funded on anything other than individual donations, it's totally bogus. I am very proud to be running a 100% grassroots campaign, powered by the people, powered by small donations from individuals. And I'm very proud of myself, that, I'm not taking corporate money. Anyone who says otherwise is totally wrong.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the clarification, Michael.
Thank you.
It's obvious that there has been, at a minimum, some kind, of misunderstanding, and perhaps, but that's all it is. But in any event, we know what the real story is now. So thank you very much. So let us move on to your platform. And the first issue on your platform, I notice, is Medicare for All. So could you tell us about that?
Absolutely. Well, healthcare is a human right, and has been forever. But it's only been in the last several years that concept that healthcare is a human right has evolved, and until Bernie Sanders, I admit I had some skepticism about the notion of single payer until it was explained to me. And, Bernie had brought it up in one of his speeches, and then I did my research and learned about, how it works in other countries. The overall cost, much lower, and health outcomes much better. And, learn more about it. And effectively, the system that we have right now, whereby, we are effectively rationing coverage, where the, wealthiest get the best care and those that have little or no cash are effectively screwed. That by covering everybody, by using a single payer system, we would have overall better health outcomes, lower costs, and other benefits like people not, having to, leave work, people not leave work for extended periods of sick leave, people not having to go bankrupt over medical bills. And it is, I feel, extending Medicare and improving it is not just the economically sound thing to do, it's the humane thing to do. And the first thing that I plan to do when I make it to D.C. is I will co-sign H.R. 676. And that's a promise I can make to you and every viewer out there.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. If I can add a couple of things about that.
Certainly.
Okay, I think that John Conyers has been introducing and reintroducing this bill into Congress. I forget now, but it's either since 2002 or 2004. In every congressional term, of Congress, he has introduced a version, of this bill. And now the current version is the best, okay, that it's ever been. Okay. And one of the funny things about this bill is that it's a very short bill, and it's very easy for people to understand. It's only 35 pages or so. And so everybody can read the bill. Okay. And I urge people to Google for this bill, okay, and to read the text in order to see for yourself all the various things that are covered in this bill. One important thing to emphasize is there are no copays in this bill. There are no deductibles in this bill. All basic care is included. Also, dental is included. Chiropractic is included. Psychiatric help is included. And it isn't limited in this bill. It's not limited to a certain number of visits, okay, or anything like that. It's what you need, the kind of care that you need, you will get under this particular bill. Okay. It's similar to Medicare in some ways in that it's a single payer bill. Okay, and it's also similar to Medicare in the name. But what you have to notice is that it's expanded and improved Medicare for all. So while Medicare doesn't include everything, this bill includes everything you need. And you don't have to ask any questions about but if you do have questions, and go to the bill, okay, and read it. As I say, okay, it's very short. But when I was talking to Steve Schiffman, okay, a couple of days ago, I got these questions. Well, does it cover this? Does it cover that? Does it cover wheelchairs? Does it cover, He was trying to find reasons why we would want people to vote for this bill or to favor this bill. Mm-hmm. But it was hard for him to find any rationalizations.
Yeah. Well, like I said, just based on the fact that you're being selective with what you cover and what you don't cover is effectively increasing the overhead cost and making it more bureaucratic. I mean, I have asked people, what do they think is the reason that we have such high health care costs? And very rarely do I hear administrative costs mentioned. The whole notion of a doctor's office having to process multiple types of insurance, having multiple insurance systems, and the bureaucracy involved in terms of how much is covered, the copays, the deductibles, all that stuff. The more complicated you make it, the more expensive it becomes. Whereas,
right. And also the insurance company costs, not just the doctor's administrative costs, but the insurance company's administrative costs, which I think amount to something like $500 to $600 billion a year. Okay, now at this point, we don't have really good estimates about how much would be saved by a Medicare for All bill, but we do know something like the following. And perhaps when you talk about this, you ought to be emphasizing things like this. What we spend as a nation on healthcare today, what we spent in 2016, was $3.4 trillion on healthcare. When I say we, I mean the American people. The reason why I say the American people is because what we paid to government to fund healthcare, that came out of our pockets. The premiums came out of our pockets. The copays came out of our pockets. And the deductibles came out of our pockets. One way or another, all $3.4 trillion came out of our pockets. Okay? There was no deficit spending in the healthcare area. Okay? We know that, but that's a fact. So the question is, how much of that $3.4 trillion can we save?
I have seen, in the research that I've done, I have seen estimates in terms of in terms of our savings would be somewhere between 200 and 600 billion dollars a year.
Okay.
I've seen other estimates suggesting it may be closer to $1 trillion, depending on just beyond the initial benefits of killing the bureaucracy and everybody having access to health care. Looking at any increases in productivity. For those that are able to then get health care when they're sick. So there does not seem to be ambiguity that there will be savings. The only question is, what size it would be. I have not seen any estimate that suggests it'll cost more.
It's pretty clear that the $200 to $500 billion savings are really gross underestimates, often made by progressives who don't want to be attacked by conservatives. Okay, in other words, who don't want to argue with conservatives, so they underestimate, essentially what the benefits could be. What I advise is don't be defensive, but be realistic about this kind of thing. We know from other countries what percent, of GDP is spent on healthcare. We know what we spend. We spend something like 17.6%, of GDP, whereas the Canadians are spending about 11% now. As a country, we're very similar. And better health outcomes. As a country, we are very similar to Canada. If they can reach 11% of GDP, there's no reason why we can't reach 11% of GDP. That translates to a savings of roughly $1.2 trillion a year. Mm-hmm. Now, I've seen some of the MMT types of economists actually contend that there might be savings of even 50% on the $3.4 trillion. That would represent the saving of $1.7 trillion a year out of our pockets. $1.7 trillion of savings for the private sector as a whole, including the households in the private sector. Okay, now that estimate could be on the high side, but I think the $1.2 trillion savings estimate is a very safe one for us over a period of it could be we would realize that in the first year, but if not, we would probably realize it in the third year, or the fourth year. But it would be getting there. Each year, big and increasing savings out of our pockets.
Oh, absolutely. And another thing that is, there will be more disposable income, for the middle class, because the money that would otherwise be, you mentioned, the money that's taken out of paychecks, by the employers, so that money would go back to the employees.
Yes, that money would go back to the employee, not necessarily under H.R. 676 as written, but if we decide to fund the federal government in a different way and to tax the federal government in a different way, which is a subject we'll get into as we move along here. So then it would be the case that there would be no specific taxes that were actually attached to this bill, as there are right now in H.R. 676.
Right, the Medicare tax, the tax on Wall Street speculation, which I would support anyway, regardless of whether it was attached to the Medicare for All bill or not.
But it matters whether it's attached to the bill or whether it's part of the general revenue of the United States, and whether we're assessing that kind of tax for the purpose of discouraging speculation.
Certainly.
Or not. Okay. So that makes a difference as to what the purpose of the tax is. Later on, we'll go into the issue of whether uh, we need to have the revenue that comes from taxes. Okay, but I did want to move on with your platform. The second item is very important, and that's ending the influence of money in politics.
One thing that I think happened in 2016 that had pretty much been brewing, perhaps since the 70s with Buckley versus Valello, was the corrupting influence of money in politics. Again, I give Bernie credit for just putting, this eloquently, noting that could one really expect an individual or an entity to provide $1 million to a political candidate and not expect something in return? I think the notion of the pay-to-play system came into the forefront, and a lot of people are now fully aware of it. And you've got organizations like Wolfpack, that are trying to end money in politics. And I, as a candidate, I want to be, beholden, to the people of Nevada only. I am not interested in being beholden, to the casino industry or the mining industry or any other, industry. And that is why, I have refused corporate money. And the nice benefit of this is I can freely, if I'm elected, put forth and advocate for the policies that I promise the people. Nobody is going to bribe me to go back on my promises. And I am in favor, as I said earlier, of overturning Citizens United. And I think we're going to have to do a constitutional amendment. I don't see any other way, unless we're willing to wait, 4 or 5 decades, to put the court more to the left, if that is even feasible. And I hope that we will at some point be able to establish a public campaign financing system, because monetary resources in politics effectively creates unfair advantages, and the people get shut out. And I'm sure the Princeton study, which showed that if there's an issue that is of interest to the public, it does not have much chance of getting heard. But if the big donors want it heard, it'll show up on the agenda.
Yes.
And this is, again, it's inhumane. It's not fair to the people.
Right. Okay. So let me ask you a question about this then. Okay. And that question is, a constitutional amendment to try to fix the problem is probably going to take a minimum of 6 or 7 years to get through. And that's assuming we can get it through the Congress, which we won't be able to do actually without a wave election, okay, in 2018 or in 2020. Even with a wave election, okay, in 2018, it is still likely Trump would be vetoing a bill. Okay, and so we might not be able to get a bill actually through in order to pass a constitutional amendment, okay, until 2020, and then it takes time for the states to ratify it, and the Republicans are now controlling the legislatures, okay, in most of the states, so we have to sweep them out by there also. We're probably looking at a minimum of 7 years to get an amendment through, and maybe that's being optimistic.
Well, compare that to perhaps 70 years. Remember,
but
Supreme Court or
that's
lifetime
not
appointments.
The only alternative, and that's the question which I need to ask you. Okay.
Well, the other
Article 3, Section 2, has a clause that's known as the exceptions clause, Article 3, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. And the exceptions clause gives the Congress the power to determine the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court to hear cases. It's within the power of Congress. It was written in by the founders, okay, and never repealed, as a check and balance on the Supreme Court, as a check on the Supreme Court, part of the check and balances system in the Constitution. Okay, and it's a rather simple thing to do. All the Congress has to do is to pass campaign finance laws, okay, and say the Supreme Court will not have jurisdiction over this law. Now, we still won't be able to get anything passed, okay, until Trump is out of office, most likely, okay, and the Republicans are out of the presidency. Okay, but at least that opens up the possibility that in 2021 we could pass campaign finance laws. In fact, the whole system of campaign finance laws that the Supreme Court would not be able to review. Would you support that?
Couldn't, under the same logic, just playing devil's advocate here.
Go ahead.
Couldn't, under the same logic, let's just say the Supreme Court, God forbid, overturns Roe versus Wade.
Yes.
And then Congress acts to ensure, under Article 3, that they would not have the ability to ever hear that type of case again.
Well, one Congress but cannot bind another Congress. Okay, so in other words, whatever law is passed by a certain Congress could be modified by a future Congress. In other words, the only thing that can stop a Congress from passing a particular law is a constitutional amendment. Okay, but I renew the question though. In 2021, if we still had the situation where the Supreme Court was blocking campaign finance legislation on grounds that corporations are persons, and this is a restriction on the free speech of corporations because money is speech, would you prevent the Supreme Court from actually reviewing a case involving the constitutionality of the law?
Well, I will be fully honest with you. This is the first I have ever heard of this idea. I mean, generally, when there's been a proposal in terms of getting money out of politics, it has been Article 5, the state convention, a calling of a convention by the states.
The state convention method is very dangerous.
Has this ever, you said it was Article 3, Section 2, right?
Yes, and you can read it. You just read Article 3, Section 2, the exception clause. It's right there. It's in a couple of sentences.
Has this ever been tried?
Not that I'm aware of. However, Tim Canova, who's a law professor, as you know, heard about this actually from me, and he's checked it out, and he agrees with it, that it can be used.
Well, what I can promise you at this point is I will look into it. I have not heard of this this solution before. I mean, generally I hear one of two things. Either it's an amendment, or in the more general sense, to try to overcome the conservative majority is to pack the court, because the Supreme Court size can be fixed by Congress. And
right.
Our other federal courts, sometimes there's three judges that hear a case, and then it gets appealed to the full board. But I have not heard of Congress using that power to constrain what the Supreme Court can hear. So best I can say at this point is
also packing the court is another alternative. Yeah. In other words, there's nothing sacred about the 9 justices in the Supreme Court as a number. It seemed to have become sacred at one time, but it's not in the Constitution. It could easily be 13 justices or 15 justices, or 11 justices.
Exactly.
So it's to be determined actually by the Congress. And that's another check, that's in the Constitution on possible tyranny by the Supreme Court. Because remember, from the viewpoint of the framers, the Congress was the people's house, or at least the House of Representatives was the people's house. And so they wanted the Congress to have checks on the other branches of government, which were the more monarchical branches, of government, both the executive and the Supreme Court, in a certain sense. If not a monarchical branch, at least an aristocratic one. So going on with your platform, there is net neutrality, a very important plank in your platform. And that I think is fairly straightforward. I don't think I want to take the time to discuss it, because I think here in our group, we have a general consensus on it. We love and must have that.
And if it weren't for net neutrality, you and I probably wouldn't be talking right now, or would be going very, very slowly, and I would be racking up hundreds of dollars on my cable bill.
Yes, and we would too. Each month, because we'd have to pay that to get any audience at all. So we'd have to come up with that kind of money. So it would, in effect, it would be a tax on us. It's a huge threat to alternative media.
Yes.
Is what it is, which is what we are. So having said that, let's get to marijuana prohibition. You have a strong position on that.
Yes, I am in favor of descheduling marijuana at the federal level. The state of my state, Nevada, in 2016 voted to legalize marijuana for recreational use. In 2000, we legalized it for medicinal use. So now this was the will of the people. We made the decision, and there has been plenty of evidence to show that marijuana has medicinal benefits and can be used safely and responsibly. Yes. So there is no reason that it needs to be made illegal by the feds. And part of the reason that I want to have it descheduled is because Jeff Sessions is saying he's going to crack down on things, and I want him and his goons to stay out of my state. And the only thing right now that I'm aware of that is preventing him from taking such action is that I forget the year that it started, and unfortunately I forget the name of the writer, the Rohrabacher Amendment, something like that. It goes to every, and I may have mispronounced his name. It goes on every budget.
No, you did pronounce his name but correctly. He was a congressman from California, a Republican congressman from California. Yeah. Actually, Dana Rohrabacher, his name was, and he was a very conservative, right winger.
Yep, and yet, because of that writer, the amount of money that the Justice Department can spend on enforcing, it specifically says medical marijuana laws, but it also, because most of the dispensaries also do rec, they can't go after them, without violating that rule anyway. So the amount of money that Justice Department is given for enforcing federal marijuana laws on the states is $0. So they came up with a very creative way to put a financial constraint on enforcing federal marijuana laws, which shouldn't even be there to begin with.
I completely agree, and I'll tell you something else. The evidence for the safety of cannabis as a drug was there in 1965. And I know that because in 1967 I did a literature review on the subject. And it was pretty plain then that there were fewer harmful effects, of marijuana, if there were any, than there are with respect to cigarettes or alcohol. And so there was no reason for the prohibition except for a witch hunt that started in the 1930s and that was being enforced by the FBI.
Anslinger.
Yes, Anslinger. It started with Anslinger, right?
Yep.
And continued under Hoover.
Yep.
Okay.
And was put on steroids by Nixon.
Yeah, right. Of course, because law and order. Law and order, right? The big law and order man. Okay. Who broke the law, of course, and had to resign from the presidency because he was a big law and order man. So when they tell you, they're big law and order people, put your hands on your pockets.
Yeah. Well,
they're about to pick them.
His vice president, Agnew, was,
yes.
He was, tough on crime, rule of law, and he was taking payoffs.
Yes, he was. So the next platform is ensure the solvency of Social Security, and there you advocate for the cap to be removed on the FICA contributions.
Yep.
So that the whole income of the person would be subject to FICA.
Exactly.
Okay, so I have a few comments on that. And you point out that would ensure the solvency of Social Security for at least 50 more years and permit the expansion of the benefits. And that is true, of course. Okay, but what is not true is that the FICA tax actually pays for Social Security.
I knew you were going to bring this up.
Right. But the reason why I say that, and also, there is no reason to believe that the Social Security Trust Fund actually funds Social Security, or that whether there is any money in the trust fund actually causally determines whether Social Security will be funded or not. And I say that for the following reason. The way Social Security is really funded at this point in time is through congressional appropriations. Congress has to appropriate the money that will be spent on Social Security each term. Okay, it has to be in the budget bills. It has to be in the CR bills. Okay, so
which is why also, sometimes you see, from year to year, differences in terms of the amount of benefits that are actually going to be paid out.
Well, actually, the reason for that, I think, is the number of people who turn 65, okay, or who do not, okay, and also whether there's a cost of living increase, okay, or there's not a cost of living increase, okay. But the next important point concerning this is that there is no account for Social Security at the Fed, okay, or any other bank. There is only an accounting record in the Treasury Department that says how much money Treasury owes to Social Security. Okay, so since there is no account with reserves in it specifically to pay Social Security payments, okay, it's clear that there are no reserves from such an account that are paying for Social Security. What
which
pays for Social Security
allows that money to be spent in other ways, leaving behind IOUs to the Treasury.
Right. Okay. We all know about, the IOUs and the Treasury stealing the Social Security money and so on and so forth. Well, it's not stealing the money. In other words, that was provided for in the law at first. It was always intended that the FICA money would end up going to the Treasury Department in some way. Now, actually, it doesn't because of the way the Fed operates. Okay, but what happens essentially is that the FICA money is actually destroyed within the banking system to contain inflation. And the way your Social Security payments are actually funded is that the Treasury spending account gets added to from time to time by the Federal Reserve when Treasury does the right things to ask for the additional money to come into the Treasury spending account. In other words, there are certain rules the Fed actually follows, which it sees, is enabling them to fill the Treasury account at certain times. Okay, but I'm not going to go into the detail of that. Yeah. The point, that I'm making here is that without the appropriation of Congress of the Social Security funds, it doesn't matter how much money the Treasury owed to Social Security, your Social Security payments would not be paid. It's the appropriation of Congress which mandates the payment of Social Security. So it's also true that if the Social Security Trust Fund was reduced to zero, which of course it will never be anyway in all the projections, it's only going to be reduced to 3/4 of the necessary amount. In making the long-term projections, even under current law. But if in the fictitious case that it was reduced to zero, it would still be the case that if Congress appropriated the money to make Social Security payments, then the Treasury Department would have to find that money, and it would use the normal methods and tools it uses to get the Federal Reserve to fill its account with the reserves that would be necessary to make the payments that were appropriated by the Congress.
Well, and this is why, I've seen this, discussed in terms of why, there is an interest in killing Social Security, by members members on the right, and that is a lot of the, financial manipulation, that you've talked about, and the, borrowing from it along with the IRUs. Well, if they kill Social Security, they don't got to pay that money back. All of that stuff, a lot of this, is
it's not about their paying the money back. Okay, it's about actually them being able to privatize Social Security in the first place.
Right, creating winners and losers.
In other words, well, what would happen, in other words, is if they were to privatize Social Security, what the Treasury Department owed to Social Security would be paid into the private Social Security accounts that would be managed on Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Peter G. Peterson has been trying to get since he was in the Nixon administration in the 1970s. For all that time, he's been trying to get the money in the Social Security Trust Fund to gamble with on Wall Street. Okay?
I got you.
So the point which I am making here is, since you are going to Congress, hopefully, as a congressman, you need to know,
fingers crossed,
you need to know that the trust fund is really just a fable. It's just a blind thing. It's an accounting record. It doesn't, as a matter of monetary reality, actually pay for Social Security. you as a congressperson pay for Social Security. Okay, and not only that, you could totally ensure payment for Social Security by ordering the Federal Reserve to place reserves in the Treasury account sufficient to pay the Social Security bill for any particular year as soon as you pass the bill. What's owed by the Treasury to Social Security notwithstanding. In other words, the record of owing, which is now somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.8K or 2.9 trillion dollars, I believe, that record could sit there permanently if every year Congress were to give an order to the Federal Reserve to place the money to pay for Social Security in that year as soon as the bill was passed. That record of owing would never have to be touched. It could sit there in perpetuity. It would never run down. It would always increase, okay, by the amount of interest that Treasury promised to pay Social Security. Okay, so you understand what I'm saying. It's all a faux device that has no basis in reality today. It's based on what Congress, and whether Social Security gets paid or not, is totally based on what Congress chooses to do and what you as a congressperson, okay, would choose to do. So we're getting...
I am for, any sort of fiscal policy or adjustment or, whatnot that ensures that those that paid into Social Security get what they paid and get what they paid for. I mean, that money belongs to us. We paid into it, and when we retire, we should be getting it. And it is not for gambling.
Okay, it belongs to us for another reason also. It is our entitlement as Americans, not because we paid into it, but because it's a human right. It's part of FDR's Bill of Rights.
Yes, you are correct.
He gave two justifications for Social Security. The first one was, we paid into it. But the later one is the more enduring one. And that is that it is part of the second Bill of Rights. And that's the way that I prefer to defend it. I don't want to get into monetary details with the Republicans or any bullshit like that.
Yeah.
We owe our seniors a decent living in their old age. That's the human right, and that's the right we have to defend.
I totally agree with you. And if you take a look at some of the other planks on my platform, I'm trying to, best of my ability, run a very human-centered, human rights, campaign centered on, as we've been talking a lot about economic justice, but also social justice as well, and environmental justice.
Okay, so I have a hard deadline here, and I know you're for those things. So, okay, I'm going to say to people, go to www.weissfornevada.com, okay, and look at the platform. But in the remaining time we have, I didn't want to raise a single issue.
You got it.
Why don't you have a federal job guarantee at a living wage as part of your platform? Is there something behind your platform, specifically a fear or some kind of idea that there is a constraint on federal spending so that you have to avoid spending too much?
No, and I am not by any means a deficit hawk. We have seen, throughout history, that the government can run a deficit and invest in this country, create jobs, invest in education, infrastructure, all of that, which inevitably, provides, for more income to the middle and working classes, more disposable income.
So my question is, why don't you advocate for a federal job guarantee at a living wage? If you did so, and you made the living wage, let's say something that was to average $20 an hour, okay, across the country, you would not need a minimum wage law. In other words, that would be the minimum wage, simply because if there's a federal job guarantee at a living wage, the private sector has to hire people at higher than that living wage to get any people. If they don't pay more than the living wage, the people will go to the federal job guarantee program.
Well, this may actually be something you can educate me on, because my understanding of the economics courses that I took in college and all of that was that in an optimal society there would be a small level of unemployment only because people will transition in between jobs, and that if corporations, as they expand, as they demand increases, all that that they can hire more people, that they would want to have at least a small pool of people to get to pick from. Now, definitely in terms of the value, say, of education, will increase somebody's marketable skills, and they'll be able to transition between jobs more readily. With regards to the minimum wage, of course, anybody that is working, deserves a living wage for sure. But actually, I don't know the answer to this, because I have been reading about this. Would a required full employment, would full employment in some way may not be as beneficial as would you reduce potentially growth in any way if you had a situation where you had nobody you didn't have a pool, at least temporarily, to pick from?
Okay, so look, we need to talk some more, and we need to go over the issue, okay, of how you're going to pay for it, okay, because I know you're not opposed to deficits now, but you're probably thinking of deficits in the conventional way as things that have to be accompanied by issuing debt instruments, which then, of course, would leave you open to the Republicans. What are we going to do about the debt? What are we going to do about the debt? And they'll be whipping you with the political issue of the debt as you advocate for the deficit spending.
Right.
Okay.
The argument.
So I have a hard deadline here tonight.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I have to end at 9:25 or so. But if you have the time, we could talk by Skype after the program, okay, is over, okay, and I could explain to you what is the solution to the debt problem, and I could also answer the question you just raised, which is actually a non-issue.
Okay, yeah, because I hope I didn't give the impression that I was advocating for unemployment. I was actually advocating for a pool where people would still have access to jobs and be able to transition between jobs, and under that best assumption that they would have the education and the credentials to transfer between jobs, and also that they would be paid fairly no matter where they went, and furthermore that if there was an unemployment pool, it would be as brief as it possibly could be for each individual.
Okay, so I'll be happy to talk over these matters, actually, for quite some time, if you like. What I'll do is I'll send you my Skype handle,
okay,
on Facebook, and then we'd be able to connect, but by Skype to continue this conversation. Okay, I promised people coming after me that I would finish at 9:25, so I'm going to have to end our broadcast right now. Okay, but thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much for having me on. It's been an honor. Hope to come back at some point. And WeissForNevada.com.
Okay, WeissForNevada.com, folks. Right. Okay, good night, everybody.
Take care, Joe.